So as I said, it's great to be back. Vacation, it's a good time, but it's also nice to get back into work, into doing something. This year's vacation was a little bit different for us. I tend to take my vacation, or at least the bulk of it, in one long chunk. It gives me a chance to really get away and refresh and recharge. Angela likes to split hers up through the year and just take a week or a day here and there as she needs it, so that she's always got a constant level of energy. So this year it was kind of interesting. She had 2 months in the summer off. I got 1 month in the summer off. And we were together for a lot of that. We hadn't been together like that for a very long time. Add to that the fact we've now got a toddler running around. Fortunately, we've got all-day daycare, but somehow we have to keep him entertained. Well, thankfully, there's that amusement park over in Vaughan, that wonderful, wonderful land. And we had arranged to get some season's passes to it so that we would be able to go there whenever we wanted or whenever we needed to. And there was a lot of flexibility in having that because it meant we didn't have to go on the weekends, where I'm told the lineups are significantly longer. We were able to get there during the week, and there were still lineups. And Jacob had to learn what the lineups meant. Now, he was pretty good about that first run through the lineup. But then there was the question, well, if the ride's over, but I want to go again, why do I have to get off and go through the line again? I'm already here. Now, that does make some sense, but there's also everyone else has been waiting. I got to go through the lineup again. And again. And again. How much do you like this ride? Evidently a lot. To help us move him around when he got off the rides and suddenly became too tired to walk, we got one of those giant wagons, which really was a great investment. We can carry him, we can carry drinks and all sorts of sustenance, so we're never really caught short. Whatever we need, we've got. And it also gives him a little bit of shade, because kids roast. Especially on this one day that I remember, it was a very hot day. The sun was beating down. Now, if you haven't been to this wonderful amusement park in a while, it's been about 10 years since I've been there, and man, has it changed. You don't really recognize how little shade there is in a lot of places there, or how quickly the shade gets filled. The sun was just so hot that day. It was great to be able to shade Jacob. It was great to be able to get him into rides where there was a roof over top of him. And it just so beakingly warm until around 3 or 4 in the afternoon when the clouds came in. It was a nice little bit of relief from all of that sun coming down. And then the clouds kept coming in. The wind started. We all know where this is going. Now, I mentioned that there wasn't a lot of cover from the sun, which also means there isn't a lot of cover from any precipitation that happens, and it happened. Oh, did it happen? Oh. You ever get that point where you're kind of wondering, you kind of want that sun back? You're like, I can take the sun, and it's so, it really puts it down on the day when something like that happens. It's a decent day, things could be a little bit better, things could be a lot worse, and then things get a lot worse. Right? It could be the weather coming down on you, or it could be something a little bit more serious. And our reaction in those can sometimes be, God, where are you? Admittedly, not so much for rain, but maybe for other things, where things go from great to not so great. When we hear about far-off disasters, when we hear about war and the casualties and the innocents who are suffering, we sometimes wonder, God, where are you? What's going on? Or maybe when those things come a little closer to home, when jobs get declared as surplus, i.e., thank you for your service. When plans that we have get ruined, maybe when we lose some of our identity. I know there were a lot of people on my Facebook feed who were posting proud photos of their kids going off to university. And they come back and I'm sure they're wondering, well, now what? What do we do now? Or maybe a few of them wonder, God, where are you? Or maybe the more permanent losses. When someone passes away and we wonder, where are you, God? In those times when things go from great to not so great, we wonder. And it seems like God is absent. It seems like God isn't even answering our prayers. We don't even get a response in those moments. God, where are you? Now, the funny thing is, we all know we're not the first people to ask that question in all of recorded human history. And if we go back to today's reading, we meet a nation of people, and in particular, an individual wondering, where is God in everything that's happening? Ezekiel was a young man who was being trained to be a priest in the temple in Jerusalem. His whole life training had gone into this. His father had been a priest. When you turned 30, you were to be ordained. Unfortunately, for this young lad, for Ezekiel, he wasn't going to get ordained. The temple, and the rest of Jerusalem, in fact, was a pile of ruins. The Babylonian army had come through a few years earlier and sacked Jerusalem, had burnt the temple to the ground, and had carted off all of its inhabitants to far-off lands. Lands that were not their ancestral homelands. And it caused this identity crisis for many people from Jerusalem, for many of the Judeans, because they were tied to this land. They were tied to the fact that their temple was in Jerusalem. If they wanted to go and make amends with God, or offer thanks to God, or just be near God, they had to go to Jerusalem. That was it. And the temple was there for them. But now it wasn't. And for Ezekiel, who had spent all of his life preparing for this ministry, it was who he was going to be, a priest in the temple. Well, now what? Now where does he go? As a nation and as an individual, they're asking, God, where are you in all this? And as Ezekiel is sitting by the river, he looks north and he sees this storm cloud coming in. Maybe it was another brutally hot day. And he saw it, and the cloud cover started, but then the storm clouds were coming in. And he was starting to get worried. He was starting to wonder what's going to happen. Then as he looks in the storm cloud, he sees some really fantastical sights. Now, I shortened the reading today a little bit. But if you want to read that first chapter of Ezekiel, you almost think you're reading out of Revelation. And in fact, it's the other way around. If you read out of Revelation, you're reading from that first bit of Ezekiel. All of these fantastical creatures and thrones and wheels. Whoa, what's going on here? You see, in first century, even before first century, this would be around the 500s BC, the Judeans, they saw storms as messages from God, generally not good ones. And here Ezekiel is in the face of this storm coming. But it's in the face of this God, where are you, that God is stepping in. Now we'll hear more about what God had to say to Ezekiel next week, but for this week, we have to recognize just how astounding this was. Remember, if they wanted to go to see God, they had to go to the temple. There was no more temple. How was God coming to see them? How was God coming to see this Ezekiel? And yet God was coming. In a time when it seemed that God had abandoned the Judeans, had let Babylon run rampant over their city, God comes in. In those times when God seems absent, that's where God is coming into our lives. In the middle of the storm, in the middle of the tumult. That's where God comes in. This coming in, this storm coming in, this vision of God in the middle of the storm, it's almost like, I kind of think of getting up first thing in the morning, and if you're a coffee drinker like me, you'll totally understand this. And if you're not a coffee drinker, bear with me. Walking as a grog, in that very groggy state, into the kitchen, you turn on your coffee maker, and you turn around, and there's God in the middle of the kitchen. That's the state that Ezekiel is in. That's the surprise that Ezekiel has, that God is here, where he completely doesn't expect God. And sometimes, when God comes in the middle of those storms in our lives, we're not ready for God. We think God is there in the happy times. God is there in the joyful times. God is there in the praising times. And yes, absolutely. God is also there in the storms and in the difficult times. And in the times when God doesn't see them or seem to be there, God is there. More than just God is there, God reveals himself. God revealed himself to Ezekiel. God reveals himself to us. We don't have to go to some special place to meet with God. God comes to meet with us. And God is wild. God is beyond what we think God is. We want this kind of safe God who's somewhat insulated by being up in heaven, sitting on the throne, listening to the angelic choir, and good, God can be up there, and when I need to go to God, I'll go to God. But no, God comes to us. God comes to us in the burning bush. God comes to us in the silence of the night. God comes to us in a storm cloud. God comes to us at the end of a day when we're just done. And God comes to us in the middle of a downpour that threatens to upend our time. Because you know what? When that rainstorm hit, it did cool down. And that rainstorm, as we know, it didn't last that long. I mean, it was a lot of rain, but it wasn't that long. And there was something that was there after the rain that wasn't there before the rain. There were a lot of puddles on the ground. And if you haven't been around a toddler recently, let me just affirm to you, those puddles are magical. All they have to do is run up and jump in them. And he was soaked through already, so who cares if his shoes get wet? And what could have easily been a disaster, it ended up being a pretty good time. And also by that point, all the rides are soaking, so everyone's kind of heading to the gates there. So we were going with traffic. And Jacob was coming along. Sometimes he was riding in the wagon because he was well and truly knackered. But sometimes he was getting out and just jumping in the puddles as he goes along. Jumping in the puddles. Having fun. Because God is there not only as a presence, but to do something. Perhaps to show us not to take ourselves a little too seriously that day. That, okay, you're soaked through. Now you can really have some fun in the puddles. And I might be lying if I said I didn't jump in a couple myself. My shoes were already soaked. Seeing God in the tempest, though, it doesn't miracle all the troubles away. We shouldn't expect that to happen. But what we should expect is to know that we aren't alone. what we should expect is to know that something good can come of this. We don't need to run for safety in the storms in our lives, because God is already there for us. We don't need to hide from shame, because God is already there with us. God knows us for all of our strengths and weaknesses, all of our warts and all of our perfections. And God still loves us. God still comes to us. God still is with us. Ezekiel could have run, but he stayed. He listened to this message. We'll hear more about that message next week, but today I just want to leave you with this idea that in the tempest, God is there. God doesn't abandon us during the difficult times. And we can seek God everywhere and every when, both in those tranquil and serene moments where everything seems to be just perfect, and in that tumult where everything seems to be completely disordered and out of place, and how are we going to get through this? We go from knowing about God to knowing God. And that is what God invites us to do. To know God, not to know facts about God, but to know what God is doing, to know what God is up to. Revelation in the Bible is never about knowing facts about God. It's never about finally figuring out how to pronounce God's name. It's about knowing what God is up to. And yes, in order to do that, we do need to know a little bit about who God is. But whenever we know who God is, that's always in service to knowing what God is doing, and where God is inviting us to partner, and to know and to trust that in the chaos of the storm, God is there with us. Let me pray for you. God of Revelation, we seek you in easy times, in comfortable times, in times when we feel in control. And we give you thanks that in those difficult times, in those distracting times, in those scary times, in those times when all of our plans seem ripped from our hands, you are still there. We ask God that we might have the courage to seek you out in those difficult times, so that we can see you easier in the clear times, and so that we might be able to glorify your holy name just a little bit easier. We ask all of this in Jesus' name.